Hi, I'm Ethan Grabowski. This is Crash Course AP World History, and today we're going to be focusing on the Russian Revolution, or rather, revolutions. As the Russian Revolution, as we know it, is really the effects of two revolutions. The February Revolution, so named because it happened in March, and the October Revolution, so named because it happened in November, that culminated in the first communist state the world had ever seen. The success of the Russian Revolution would inspire places like China and Mongolia. No, Nikon, not those Mongols. But, as I was saying, it inspired places like this to start their own revolutions, and it really put communism on the map. Oh, Mr. Grabowski! Mr. Grabowski! Talk about how the Russian Revolution changed the ideals of the human race for better or for worse? Oh, me from the past, you haven't lived long enough to have your idealism crushed by the rest of the world yet. But yes, sort of. The seeds of the revolution were actually laid in 1904 or 1905 when Tsar Nicholas II decided to pursue Russian expansion into Manchuria. The resulting war with and loss at the hands of the Japanese led to strikes and riots from the peasant population. In January of 1905, crowd control fired on a group of protesters and the day was nicknamed Bloody Sunday. This didn't go over well with the public, and so Nicholas figured the best and possibly only way to save face would be to grant a constitution and start a parliament. This parliament had two parts. The lower half was called the Gosudarstvennya, however you say it, Duma, or State Assembly, and often nicknamed the Duma because who wants to say who wants to say that every time they want to talk about the State Assembly? The upper half was the State Council. This body of elected officials was established in Nicholas's October Manifesto of 1905, but it didn't actively start until 1906. Despite the Tsar's assurances that it would be a representative assembly and that it would be necessary for legislation, the fundamental laws that were issued literally 1 month before the first Duma meeting restricted much of its ability to actually legislate, taking away its control of state ministers and parts of the state budget. The first two Dumas were largely a representation of the peasant class. The government expected the peasants to be as conservative as them, but the peasant class was largely dominated by liberals and socialists, which were very loud about the opinions that didn't sit well with the rest of the government. Both were dissolved by the Tsar, but the third Duma was conservative and served its full term. The fourth Duma, despite being conservative, got pretty fed up with the government's choices during World War I and was pretty willing to go along with the upcoming revolution in March. He then established the first provisional government after the successful February Revolution.
As for the revolutions, the February Revolution took place in March of 1917. To the Russians, who were still using the Julian calendar at this point, it was February, but to the rest of us, it makes for a confusing story. Anyway, the February Revolution was triggered, for the most part, by food shortages, especially bread, which in turn was caused by an economy that was kicking the bucket, and the constant shortcomings of the Russian military during World War I. Starting with riots and strikes in St. Petersburg, which was called Petrograd back then, the revolution was regarded by many people both in and out of Russia as nothing, but clearly not anything that could threaten the power of the existing government. In the days that following these statements, the revolution showed itself to be much more than that. Tsar Nicholas II was already disliked by pretty much everyone but his family, so when he ordered the military to control the peasants, many soldiers decided to join the revolution. On March 15th, Nicholas tried to pull all this stuff on his brother, Grand Duke Michael, by offering the throne to him, to which his brother replied, "No." Perhaps this isn't a direct quote. He might have been a tad less conservative with his language, but it's close enough. Of course, any of you who have seen Anastasia will know that the Tsar's family didn't make it long after the October Revolution, which, again, happened in November, Julian calendar, after the Bolsheviks seized power from the provisional government. The Bolsheviks were a right-wing political group led by Lenin and born from the disgruntled labor workers, and was the main communist force in Russia that wasn't very respected by the government and kicked out quite often.
So there were a number of noteworthy members of the Bolsheviks, namely Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. John Lennon was born October 9, 1940 in Liverpool, England, and went on to become one of the most influential people in the world of music throughout his time in the popular rock band The Beatles.
No.
Well, I've been informed by Nikon that we're supposed to be focusing on Vladimir Lenin, born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov on April 22nd, 1870, in Simbirsk, to a wealthy and intellectual family. He went to school, but was kicked out of university after his radical views were exposed. After finishing his law degree in other places, he became a full-time revolutionary and started the Bolsheviks. He was seen as the middle of the three, as he was at times cruel and uncompassionate to his people, but it was often in the aims of what he saw as the greater good, and he did believe in the ideals of communism. For example, he was once quoted as saying, "Democracy is the rule of the majority. As long as the will of the majority was not clear, as long as it was possible to make it out to be unclear, at least with a grain of plausibility, the people were offered a counter-revolutionary bourgeois government disguised as democratic." But this delay could not last long. During the several months that have passed since February 27th, the will of the majority of the workers and peasants of the overwhelming majority of the country's population have become clear in more than a general sense. Their will has found expression in mass organizations, the Soviets of workers, soldiers, peasants, and deputies. He died not too long after the revolution ended due to a failed assassination attempt in 1918, which affected his long-term health. He had a stroke in 1922, from which he never fully recovered, and died in 1924. It's interesting to note, actually, that he was worried about the way the USSR was going in his later years, and especially over Stalin. Moving on, Leon Trotsky, born Lev Davidovich Bronstein on November 7, 1879, in Yanovka, Ukraine, which was, at that point, under Russian control. Anyways, he was a part of a family of Jewish farmers. Trotsky wasn't exactly financially well endowed, and as a teenager he joined several resistance groups. He was eventually arrested and exiled to Siberia from involvement in these groups, where he would later join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It was here Trotsky first met Lenin, who was a part of the Bolshevik faction of the party, whereas Trotsky was a part of the Menshevik faction. Trotsky came up with the idea of a permanent revolution, in which the idea that a country that had not become entirely capitalist should have its proletariat class ally with the peasant class to pursue the ideas of socialism and communism. Following the February Revolution, Trotsky returned to Russia. Despite past disagreements with Lenin, Trotsky decided to join the Bolshevik Party, now a large fixture in the Russian government in the wake of the recent governmental upheaval, and helped enough to make the October Revolution a successful one. From there, he was the foreign commissar of the new government and negotiated peace terms with Germany following World War I. Trotsky was good enough at what he did to the point where he was promoted to War Commissar, where he built the Red Army and for the most part kept the Bolshevik regime alive. When Lenin died, Trotsky was the obvious choice for the job. He was a very firm believer in the ideas of communism and seemed immune to corruption, quoted saying, "The party that leans upon the workers but serves the bourgeoisie in the period of the greatest sharpening of the class struggle cannot but sense the smells wafted from the waiting grave." However, his intellectual arrogance made him insufferable to work with. This, coupled with his Jewish heritage and Stalin's recent maneuvering to gain the political favor of the Bolshevik regime, ended with another exile from Russia, this time at the hands of Stalin. He lived the rest of his days traveling around Europe and finally settled in Mexico, where he was assassinated on August 20th, 1940, with an ice pick.
Which reminds me, it's time for the open letter. First, let's see what the secret compartment has for us today. An ice pick. Dear Ice Picks, why do you have to look so dang threatening? I mean, you're literally just a handle with a long pointy thing attached to it. It's no wonder you used to perform lobotomies in the late 1800s. While you might have some use, you look freaking dangerous. Even when not in the hands of a psychotic serial killer. And even worse, your name is used to refer to an ice axe anywhere that isn't the US. And what's worse, by using the same name, you steal credit for being used to kill Trotsky in Mexico after he was in hiding for 11 years. I mean, couldn't you at least just do a half-assed reboot of yourself and wish you were as great as you used to be, like the music and film industry, instead of stealing credit for such a major murderer in history? Best wishes, Nikon Chapter.
Anyway, Trotsky was hit in the head with an ice axe by an assassin who was sent by Stalin. But he didn't die from his injuries until the next day. What a way to go, huh? Ugh. Of course, the man you've all heard so much about, Stalin. Born Yosif Vissarionovich Zhugashvili. Well, I'm glad he changed his name to Stalin. On December 18th, 1879, in Gori, Georgia, to a rather modest family. Raised under equally modest circumstances, he studied at a theological seminary, but never graduated, instead focusing himself on the revolutionary movement after reading some Marxist literature. Much like Trotsky, Stalin's involvement in the revolutionary stuff got him arrested more than once and eventually exiled to Siberia. Returning to Russia at a later date, Stalin was not one of the major players in the 1917 revolutions, but quickly worked his way through the ranks of the Bolshevik Party throughout 1922, eventually settling into the role of General Secretary. While the job was not viewed as necessarily important, it gave him a place to access appointments and to build a base of support for future political endeavors. The latter would prove useful following Lenin's death in 1924, when Stalin would outmaneuver Trotsky and become head of the Communist Party. He went on to become a power-hungry dictator, the tater only being added for the sake of being shown in school. He selectively starved people, killed those who didn't agree with him, and was even quoted saying such things as, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Those who vote decide nothing, those who count the vote decide everything, and ideas are far more powerful than guns. We don't let our people have guns, why should we let them have ideas?" The only silver lining to this was the fact that he oversaw the war machine that played a big role in bringing down Nazi Germany. Coincidentally, Stalin was responsible for more deaths than the Holocaust. Well, the more you know.
So just basic overview. Lenin was balanced, Trotsky was a firm believer in communism, but he was pretty intellectually arrogant, and Stalin was a dictator who used communism as an excuse to stay in power. Overall, the Russian Revolution is a very questionable topic. People are very hasty to denounce the USSR. But did they ever actually achieve the goals and ideas that were set in the revolution? Or was it just gamed by power-hungry individuals to gain control? That's for you to decide.